The Texas sky burned crimson that evening, stretched thin as parchment over the Llano Estacado. Heat shimmered off the hard-pan earth like prayers rising from drought-cracked soil. Martha Caldwell stood at the edge of her small homestead, watching the horizon swallow the sun whole. Her calloused hands gripped the wooden bucket she'd been carrying from the well, knuckles white against weathered skin that told stories of 27 harsh summers on the frontier. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The silence pressed against her eardrums. No meadowlarks. No coyote songs. Even the wind had stilled, as if the prairie itself was holding its breath. Martha had learned to read these silences during her 3 years alone on the claim. They meant weather coming, or worse. Tonight felt different, though. Tonight the air tasted of copper and distant smoke. She turned toward the small cabin her deceased husband had built with his own bleeding hands. The logs were chinked tight against winter winds, the roof patched with whatever materials they could scavenge from the trading post 30 miles south. It wasn't much, but it had sheltered her through the loneliest chapters of her life. Thomas had been dead 2 winters now, taken by fever that no amount of prayer or poultices could break. The consumption had hollowed him out slowly, deliberately, until she was nursing a ghost who whispered her name in his sleep. Martha had stayed because leaving felt like surrender. The land held too much of Thomas, too many memories pressed into the soil like footprints. His voice still echoed in the creak of the porch boards he'd laid. His laughter lived in the cottonwood he'd planted by the kitchen window. Some mornings, she woke expecting to find him splitting kindling by the shed, sleeves rolled up, humming hymns off key. The well rope squeaked as she lowered the bucket again. Water was precious here, drawn from an underground spring Thomas had found by following deer trails and his own stubborn hope. She'd watched him dig that well in the brutal heat of their first summer, blisters breaking and healing and breaking again on his palms. Now she drew from it alone, measuring each cupful like liquid gold. Inside the cabin, lamplight threw dancing shadows against the walls. Martha had painted those walls herself with whitewash traded for eggs and preserved vegetables. The color reminded her of the church back in Tennessee, where she'd grown up singing in the choir and believing in the kindness of Providence. Faith felt different out here on the frontier, less certain, more tested by wind and weather and the particular kind of loneliness that came from watching the horizon for riders who never appeared. She heated beans in the iron pot Thomas had hauled from San Antonio on their wedding trip. The metal was seasoned with years of use, blackened and smooth as river stone. Cooking for one had taken adjustment. She'd learned to make smaller portions, to save leftovers in the root cellar Thomas had, carved into the hillside behind the cabin. Even now, she sometimes caught herself setting 2 plates out of habit. The trading post families called her brave for staying alone so far from town. Brave or foolish, depending on who was talking and how much whiskey had loosened their tongues. Sarah Patterson, the preacher's wife, had offered her a room in town more than once. "It ain't natural," she'd said. "A woman alone out here with the Comanche stirring up trouble again." But Martha had declined each offer with polite firmness. This land was all she had left of the life she'd planned to build with Thomas. She'd learned to shoot the rifle Thomas had left propped by the door, practiced until her shoulder was purple with bruises and her ears rang from the reports echoing off the canyon walls. The weapon felt foreign in her hands, too heavy, too final. But she'd grown steady with it. Could hit a tin can at 50 yards now, could load and fire without thinking. The skill brought no comfort, only a cold, practical knowledge that survival demanded sacrifices. Evenings were the hardest part. When the chores were finished and the cabin fell quiet, memories rose like smoke from dying embers. She'd taken to reading aloud to fill the silence. Thomas's Bible mostly, though she'd traded for a volume of poetry at the post last spring. The words felt different spoken into empty air. Less like conversation, more like incantation. As if language itself could ward off the crushing weight of solitude. The small mirror above the wash basin reflected a woman she sometimes didn't recognize. Sun and wind had carved lines around her eyes, darkened her skin despite the bonnet she wore during field work. Her hair, once honey blonde and soft, had dulled to the color of winter grass. She kept it pinned severely back, practical and unadorned. Beauty felt like a luxury she could no longer afford. Martha had been born in Tennessee Hill country, raised on corn and scripture, and her mother's fierce determination. Her father had died young, leaving her mother to raise 4 children alone. Martha learned early that strength came not from avoiding hardship, but from walking through it with dignity intact. When Thomas had proposed moving west to claim land under the Homestead Act, she'd agreed despite her mother's tears and warnings. Adventure had seemed possible then, wrapped in love and shared dreams. The first year had been brutal. Thomas fell sick with fever just as winter settled over the plains. She'd nursed him through delirium and despair, melting snow for water when the well froze, burning furniture when the firewood ran out. They'd survived on dried beans and prayer, on stubborn hope, and the kind of love that burns steady even in the coldest seasons. When spring finally came, they'd emerged from that cabin changed, tempered like metal in flame. The second year brought drought. Crops withered in fields that cracked like broken pottery. The few neighbors within riding distance packed up and headed back east, defeated by a land that seemed determined to test every dream brought to it. Martha and Thomas stayed. They dug deeper for water, planted hardier seeds, learned to read the sky for signs of rain that came too seldom and too late. Thomas had been working on expanding the cabin when the consumption took hold. The fever started small, just a cough that lingered after a head cold. But it grew, feeding on his lungs like some invisible fire. Martha tried everything mustard: plasters, honey, and whiskey, steam tents made from boiling sage. She rode 20 miles to fetch the circuit doctor, who charged $5 to confirm what she already knew. The disease would take its course. All she could do was make him comfortable. She'd held his hand through the final night, listening to his breathing grow shallow and strange. He'd talked about the garden they'd planned to plant come spring, about the children they'd hoped to raise in the clean prairie air. His last words were about the sunrise, how beautiful it looked through the eastern window. Martha had turned to look, and when she turned back, he was gone. Silent as snow, peaceful as Sunday morning. The burial had been the hardest part. Digging in frozen ground with tools too big for her hands. Wrapping Thomas in the quilt her grandmother had sewn for their wedding. She'd marked the grave with stones arranged in a cross, planted wildflower seeds around the perimeter. Come spring, the flowers had bloomed purple and gold, nodding in prairie winds like small prayers made visible. Neighbors had helped through that first winter of widowhood, bringing food, checking the livestock, offering to buy her claim and help her relocate somewhere less isolated. But as months passed and she proved capable of surviving alone, the visits grew less frequent. People had their own troubles, their own struggles with the unforgiving landscape. Grief was a luxury the frontier couldn't afford for long. Martha learned to appreciate solitude in ways she'd never expected. The cabin held peace now, a quiet that felt earned rather than imposed. She'd developed routines that marked the passage of days: feeding the chickens at dawn, checking the vegetable garden at midday, reading by lamplight after supper. The rhythms were simple but sufficient, like a heartbeat sustaining life through sheer persistence. The root cellar stayed well stocked through careful planning and relentless labor. She'd learned to preserve everything: vegetables in salt brine, meat in the smokehouse behind the cabin, fruits dried on screens in the summer heat. The work kept her hands busy and her mind focused on practical concerns rather than the ache of missing Thomas. Self-sufficiency had become a form of prayer. Each jar sealed and stored a small act of faith in her own survival. Trade with the nearby settlement happened rarely but necessarily. She bartered eggs and vegetables for ammunition, coffee, occasional luxuries like sugar or ribbons. The trading post owner, Benjamin Porter, treated her with careful respect. His wife Rebecca had been kind during Thomas's illness, bringing soup and offering to help with washing. But even their friendship carried the weight of distance, the acknowledgement that Martha's chosen isolation set her apart from normal community life. The small livestock required daily attention. 6 chickens, 2 goats, and a milk cow named Bessie, that Thomas had bought from a family heading back to Missouri. The animals provided eggs, milk, occasional meat when times were especially lean. Martha had learned to doctor their ailments, to assist with difficult births, to recognize the signs of predators in the area. Responsibility for their welfare gave structure to days that might otherwise drift aimlessly. Letter writing had become her primary connection to the world beyond the homestead. She corresponded with her sister in Tennessee, with Thomas's brother in Arkansas, with a few former neighbors who'd relocated to different territories. The letters traveled slowly, carried by circuit riders and freight wagons, sometimes taking months to reach their destinations. But the correspondence maintained threads of relationship across impossible distances. Evening prayers had evolved from formal recitations to conversations with the vast silence surrounding her cabin. She spoke to God, to Thomas, to the wind itself about the day's small victories and persistent worries. The practice brought comfort without requiring belief in specific answers. Faith had simplified into gratitude for each day survived, each season successfully navigated. The rifle had become as familiar as any household tool. She cleaned it weekly, practiced loading and firing until the motions were automatic. Thomas had taught her to shoot before his illness worsened, understanding that survival might someday depend on her willingness to defend herself. The skill felt like a burden and a gift simultaneously, power she hoped never to use, but was grateful to possess. Sleep came easier now than in the first months after Thomas's death. Exhaustion helped, but so did acceptance of her circumstances. She'd stopped expecting rescue or romance, stopped scanning the horizon for riders bringing news of change. The future had narrowed to seasonal cycles and immediate necessities. Tomorrow would bring more of the same: water to draw, animals to tend, the relentless but manageable work of staying alive. The cabin held memories in every corner, but they'd lost their sharp edges through repetition and time. Thomas's presence had become a comfortable ghost, less painful than precious. She still set aside his favorite cup, still avoided sitting in his preferred chair by the fire. But grief had transformed from raw wound to gentle ache, manageable and strangely comforting in its familiarity. This evening felt different, though. Martha couldn't shake the sensation of being watched, of invisible eyes tracking her movements from the darkness beyond her small circle of lamplight. The feeling had started 3 days ago, a prickle between her shoulder blades when she worked in the garden. She'd seen no signs of intruders, found no tracks around the cabin. But instinct whispered warnings that logic couldn't dismiss. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The trading post talk had grown increasingly serious about Comanche raids along the frontier settlements. War parties moving south from the Llano Estacado, burning isolated homesteads, taking captives, disappearing back into the vast grasslands. Like smoke into wind. The stories varied in detail but shared common themes: sudden violence, families scattered, the inadequacy of distance as protection against determined raiders. Martha had considered her options without finding good ones. Moving to town meant abandoning everything she'd built, everything Thomas had died believing in. Staying meant accepting risks that seemed to grow larger each passing week. She'd chosen to stay, but the decision felt less like courage and more like stubborn refusal to let fear make her choices for her. The darkness beyond her window seemed deeper tonight, more complete. Stars that usually provided small comfort were hidden behind clouds that promised rain, but delivered only humid tension. Martha finished her simple supper and began the evening routine of securing the cabin for night. Each window checked and latched, each door tested twice, the rifle loaded and positioned within easy reach of her bed. As she prepared for sleep, the sensation of being watched intensified. Not imagination now, but certainty that something waited in the darkness beyond her walls. Something patient and intelligent and potentially dangerous. Martha extinguished the lamp and lay still in her narrow bed, listening to the silence with every nerve alert, waiting for whatever morning might bring to her small sanctuary on the edge of nowhere. Dawn broke gray and troubled, like smoke rising from yesterday's ashes. Martha woke to the sound that had haunted her dreams, distant thunder that wasn't thunder at all, but hoofbeats drumming against packed earth. She rolled from her narrow bed, bare feet hitting the cold wooden floor, as her hand instinctively reached for the rifle. Through the eastern window, she glimpsed riders silhouetted against the pale sky, moving fast across the ridge that separated her homestead from the Whitmore settlement, 15 miles north, the Whitmore place. Martha's stomach clenched as she counted the riders. Too many, moving with the fluid coordination of a war party rather than the scattered urgency of fleeing settlers. Behind them, a thin column of black smoke rose straight into the still morning air. No wind to bend it, no natural cause to explain it. The settlement was burning. She dressed quickly in her darkest clothes, fingers trembling as she laced her boots. The riders had disappeared beyond the southern hills, but smoke continued to stain the horizon like a bruise spreading across pale skin. Martha had visited the Whitmore settlement just last month, trading preserved vegetables for coffee and news. 12 families lived there, maybe 40 souls total, including children who played in the dusty streets while their parents conducted business at the general store. The sound came again. Closer now, not hoofbeats this time, but voices carried on the morning air, high, frightened, unmistakably young. Martha grabbed her rifle and stepped onto the porch, scanning the landscape for movement. There, emerging from the creek bed that wound through the cottonwoods, a small procession of figures stumbled toward her cabin. Children, she realized with a start. 7 of them, ranging from what looked like 16 down to perhaps 6 years old, supporting each other as they climbed the gentle slope toward her home. Their clothes were torn and dirty, stained with creek water and what might have been blood. The oldest, a girl with auburn hair escaping from a ragged braid, carried a baby who couldn't have been more than 2. Behind her, 6 other children followed in a loose line, holding hands, stumbling with exhaustion and shock. Their faces were streaked with tears and soot, eyes wide with the particular terror that comes from witnessing unthinkable things. Martha lowered her rifle and hurried toward them. The oldest girl looked up as she approached, and Martha saw intelligence. There, despite the fear, someone who had taken charge in the midst of chaos, who had somehow managed to keep this small group together and moving. The girl's dress had been practical calico once, now torn at the sleeve and hem, revealing scratches on her arms from running through brush. "Please," the girl said, her voice cracked but determined. "Please, ma'am, we need help." They came at first light. Pa said to run for the creek and hide, but we could hear the screaming, and she stopped, swallowing hard, adjusting her grip on the baby who had begun to whimper softly. "What's your name, child?" Martha asked gently, taking in the group behind her 5 boys and 1 other girl, all clearly related by their shared auburn hair and green eyes, except for the baby whose darker coloring suggested she belonged to a different family. "Elizabeth Whitmore," the girl replied. "These are my brothers, Samuel, Daniel, Joseph, Michael, and little Robert. This here's my sister Anne, and the baby. The baby's Lucy Morrison. Her folks." Elizabeth's voice broke completely. Martha didn't need her to finish. She could see the story written in their torn clothes, their exhausted faces, the way they clustered together like sparrows before a storm. The Whitmore children had escaped the attack that claimed their parents, somehow gathering baby Lucy from whatever tragedy had befallen the Morrison family. 17 years old at most, Elizabeth had become mother and protector to 6 siblings and an orphaned infant in the space of a single terrible morning. "Come inside," Martha said, reaching for one of the smaller boys who was swaying on his feet. "All of you. We'll get you fed and—" She paused, listening to the distant sound of hoofbeats again, this time from the south. The war party was moving, and her isolated cabin lay directly in their path. The children heard it too. Fear rippled through the group like wind through wheat, and they pressed closer together. Elizabeth straightened, her chin lifting with desperate courage. "If we're putting you in danger, ma'am, we'll move on. We won't bring trouble to your door." But Martha was already herding them toward the cabin, her mind racing through possibilities and finding none of them good. 7 children couldn't outrun mounted warriors across open grassland. They couldn't hide in the sparse brush that dotted the prairie. And they certainly couldn't fight, not even with her rifle to help. The cabin itself was defensible, but not against the kind of force that had overwhelmed an entire settlement. Inside, the children huddled near the cold fireplace, while Martha moved quickly around the small space, gathering supplies. Food that could travel, water containers, ammunition for the rifle, a small bag of silver coins she'd been saving for emergencies. Her hands worked automatically while her mind struggled with an impossible decision. Stay and fight, almost certainly, dying with all 7 children, or run and hope to find somewhere better to make their stand. "Miss Elizabeth," she said, turning to face the girl who was attempting to comfort baby Lucy with soft humming. "How long since you left the settlement?" "Maybe 2 hours, ma'am. We hid in the creek until the worst of the noise stopped, then started walking. Didn't know where else to go." Elizabeth's voice carried the exhaustion of someone who had aged years in a single morning. 2 hours. The war party would have had time to finish their business at the settlement, to gather whatever spoils they sought, perhaps to rest their horses. But they would be moving again soon, following the creek bed or the main trail, searching for any survivors who might have escaped their initial attack. Martha's cabin sat like a beacon on the landscape, impossible to miss, impossible to defend. Unless the cave. Thomas had found it during their second summer, following deer trails up into the red sandstone bluffs that rose behind their property. A natural shelter carved by water and time, hidden behind a screen of scrub oak and wild grape vines. Deep enough to hide 20 people, with a narrow entrance that could be defended by one person with a rifle. Thomas had planned to use it for storage, maybe as a root cellar, but illness had prevented him from improving it. "We're leaving," Martha announced, shouldering a canvas sack filled with supplies. "There's a place I know, up in the rocks. We can hide there until the danger passes." The older boys, Samuel and Daniel, maybe 13 and 11, exchanged glances. Samuel cleared his throat. "Ma'am, if they follow our tracks from the creek, ... Then we'll deal with that when it happens." Martha checked the rifle's loading one more time, then slung it across her shoulder. "Right now, staying here means dying here. All of us." Elizabeth stood, settling baby Lucy more securely in her arms. "What can we do to help?" Martha looked at this remarkable girl who had somehow kept 7 children alive through unimaginable terror, who was asking how to help rather than demanding answers or protection. "Keep them together, keep them quiet, and trust me to find us somewhere safe." They left through the back door, moving in single file toward the rocky bluffs that rose like a wall behind Martha's small homestead. She led them along deer trails she'd learned during 3 years of solitary exploration, paths that wound between stands of mesquite and prickly pear, taking advantage of every depression and fold in the landscape. The children followed without complaint, even the youngest ones understanding that silence might mean survival. The climb grew steeper as they approached the bluffs. Red sandstone rose in layers, carved by wind and water into fantastic shapes that provided both cover and confusion for anyone trying to follow their trail. Martha chose the most difficult path deliberately, forcing them to scramble over rocks that would leave minimal tracks, pausing frequently to ensure the baby remained quiet and the smaller children could keep up. Behind them, smoke from the Whitmore settlement continued to darken the sky. But closer now, much closer, came the sound they'd all been dreading: hoofbeats on the prairie below, moving at the steady pace of trackers following the trail. The war party had found their tracks from the creek, had followed them to Martha's cabin, and would soon discover the path leading toward the bluffs. "Faster," Martha whispered, helping young Robert scramble over a boulder that came up to his chest. Just a little farther now. The cave entrance was hidden exactly as she remembered, a dark gap in the red stone, screened by twisted oak branches and wild grapevines that had grown thick over the summer. Martha pushed through the vegetation, holding branches aside for the children to pass. The opening was narrow, requiring them to stoop, but it widened quickly into a natural chamber, large enough for their small group. Inside, the air was cool and still, carrying the mineral scent of stone and the faint sweetness of cave-dwelling bats. Light filtered through the entrance, enough to see by, but the rear of the cave disappeared into comforting darkness. Martha had explored it thoroughly during her second summer with Thomas, mapping every chamber and passage, confirming that it had no other entrances that might compromise their security. The children settled into the space with the adaptability of youth, older siblings automatically tending to younger ones. Elizabeth found a smooth section of cave floor for baby Lucy, while the boys arranged themselves near the entrance where they could watch and listen. Little Anne, perhaps 8 years old, curled up against the cave wall and closed her eyes, exhaustion finally claiming her. "How long do we wait?" Samuel asked quietly, his young face serious beyond his years. Martha positioned herself where she could watch the entrance while keeping the rifle ready. "Until they give up looking. Could be hours. Could be days. And if they find us?" She met his gaze steadily. "Then we make them pay for it." Outside, the hoofbeats grew closer. Martha counted at least 8 horses, maybe more, moving at the deliberate pace of hunters following sign. They'd reached her cabin by now, searching it for survivors or supplies. Soon they would find the trail leading toward the bluffs, would begin the patient work of tracking their quarry to its hiding place. Elizabeth had managed to quiet baby Lucy, but the infant's whimpers echoed softly in the cave. The sound that might normally bring comfort now carried the potential for discovery and death. Martha watched the older girl's face, saw the terrible understanding there, that 7 children's lives might depend on keeping one baby silent. "There's water deeper in the cave," Martha whispered, pointing toward the darkness behind them, "and it stays cool even in summer heat. We can last a long time here if we need to." But even as she spoke, they all heard it, voices now, not just hoofbeats. Men calling to each other in a language none of them recognized, though the tone was unmistakable. Hunters coordinating their search, spreading out to cover more ground, getting closer to the secret entrance that was their only sanctuary. The children pressed closer together in the cave's cool darkness. 7 young souls and one determined woman, waiting to discover whether their desperate gamble would save them or simply postpone the inevitable. Outside, danger moved through the prairie landscape with methodical purpose, following every track, investigating every possible hiding place, drawing steadily closer to narrow entrance screened by oak branches and wild grapevines. Time stretched like a held breath. Baby Lucy's quiet breathing seemed loud as thunder in the confined space. Martha's finger rested on the rifle's trigger, ready to sell their lives as dearly as possible if discovery came. But for now, They had achieved something precious, a moment of safety stolen from the jaws of catastrophe, a chance to hope that patience and darkness might prove stronger than pursuit and daylight. The hunt continued outside their hidden refuge. Voices calling, horses moving, the relentless search for survivors who had vanished into stone and shadow. Like ghosts fleeing Judgment Day. The first hour passed in silence, broken only by the whisper of breath against stone and the distant echo of hoofbeats circling their refuge. Martha positioned herself at the cave entrance, rifle barrel resting on a natural ledge that allowed her to observe the scrub oak screening without exposing herself to view. The children had arranged themselves in a protective semicircle around baby Lucy, oldest to youngest, with Elizabeth maintaining quiet authority over the group through gentle gestures and meaningful glances. Daniel, the 11-year-old with hair the color of autumn leaves, proved himself remarkably adept at entertaining the younger ones without making sound. His hands moved in elaborate shadow puppets against the cave wall where filtered sunlight provided a natural theater. Rabbits chased foxes across stone surfaces while little Robert watched with wide eyes, occasionally covering his mouth to stifle giggles that might carry beyond their sanctuary. Martha found herself studying Elizabeth during the long, quiet stretches. The girl moved with unconscious competence, adjusting baby Lucy's position when she fussed, distributing small portions of hardtack from her own pocket to the younger children, managing 7 distinct personalities with the skill of someone born to leadership. Yet beneath the capable exterior, Martha recognized the tremor in those slender hands, the way Elizabeth's eyes would sometimes lose focus as memory intruded on the present moment. "Tell me about your family," Martha whispered during the lull when the voices outside seemed farther away. Elizabeth's fingers smoothed baby Lucy's dark hair before she answered. "Pa ran the general store in Whitmore. Ma taught school when there were enough children to warrant lessons. We moved out from Arkansas 3 years ago, looking for opportunity and open space." She paused, swallowing hard. "Pa always said the frontier rewarded those brave enough to claim it." Samuel, the 13-year-old who carried himself like a man despite his youth, shifted closer to his sister. "Pa made Elizabeth learn to read and write proper, said she had the mind for it. She was helping Ma with the school lessons, teaching the little ones their letters." Martha nodded, recognizing the quality she'd sensed in Elizabeth, not just intelligence, but the particular kind of practical wisdom that comes from being trusted with real responsibility. "And the Morrison baby? Lucy's ma died birthing her last winter," Elizabeth explained, her voice barely audible. "Her pa, James Morrison, he tried to manage alone, but a man can't nurse an infant. Ma helped when she could, and when the attack came—" She stopped, unable to finish the sentence. Martha filled in the gaps silently. James Morrison had trusted his daughter to the Whitmore family when death came calling, probably with his last breath. The baby represented not just an orphaned child, but a sacred trust passed between dying parents and surviving neighbors. Elizabeth understood this burden. It showed in the fierce protectiveness with which she cradled the infant. The voices outside grew closer again, and conversation died as every ear strained to interpret the sounds. Horses moving through the brush, men calling to each other in sharp syllables that carried the rhythm of organized search. Martha gripped her rifle tighter, calculating angles and distances, mentally rehearsing the sequence of shots that might buy them precious seconds if discovery came. Young Joseph, perhaps 9 years old, had discovered the cave's acoustic properties. A whisper in one corner could be heard clearly 20 feet away, while normal speech seemed to vanish into the stone walls. He experimented quietly, mouthing words to his siblings across the chamber, delighting in their surprised expressions. When his soundless communications reached them perfectly, the discovery provided both entertainment and tactical advantage. They could coordinate silently while remaining invisible to outside ears. Martha had brought enough food for one person for several days. but 8 mouths would exhaust their supplies. Quickly, she calculated portions mentally, stretching jerky and hardtack to last as long as possible while ensuring the children maintained strength. Baby Lucy presented the greatest challenge. Without proper milk, she would weaken rapidly. Elizabeth had been feeding her softened hardtack soaked in water, but the infant needed more substantial nutrition soon. "There's a spring deeper in the cave," Martha whispered to Elizabeth during another quiet period. "Sweet water never runs dry. And if we need to, there are other chambers back there, places to hide even if they find this entrance." Elizabeth nodded, filing away the information with the systematic precision of someone accustomed to keeping track of crucial details. "How do you know so much about this place?" "My husband found it, Thomas. He explored every inch during our second summer here, mapping passages and chambers. Said it might come in handy someday." Martha's voice caught slightly on his name. "Guess he was right." The afternoon stretched endlessly, marked only by the changing quality of light filtering through the cave entrance. Outside, the search continued with methodical thoroughness. Voices would approach until Martha tensed for discovery, then fade as the hunters moved to investigate other possibilities. The war party was being systematic, leaving no stone unturned, no potential hiding place unexplored. Michael, the 6-year-old who had remained silent since their arrival, finally spoke in a whisper so soft it barely carried across the cave. "I'm scared, Lizzie." Elizabeth shifted baby Lucy to one arm and pulled her youngest brother close with the other. "I know, Mickey. But we're safe here. Mrs. Caldwell is taking good care of us." Martha felt the weight of that trust, the terrible responsibility of 8 lives, depending on her knowledge of this hidden sanctuary. These children had lost everything: parents, home, security, future, in the span of a few terrible hours. Now they clung to her competence and her cave as their only hope of survival. "Tell us a story," Anne suggested from her position against the cave wall. "Something happy." Elizabeth looked to Martha questioningly, seeking permission to break the imposed silence. Martha nodded, understanding that morale mattered as much as secrecy in their current situation. Fear could be as dangerous as discovery, despair as deadly as exposure. "Once upon a time," Elizabeth began in the softest possible whisper, "there was a kingdom made entirely of caves, where the people lived in beautiful chambers carved from crystal and gold. The princess of this kingdom had 7 loyal companions who helped her protect the realm from dragons that lived in the world above ground." The younger children settled closer as Elizabeth wove her tale, transforming their dire circumstances into an adventure story where caves meant safety rather than entrapment, where small groups could triumph over overwhelming odds through courage and loyalty. Martha listened with one ear while maintaining her vigil at the entrance, impressed by the girl's instinctive understanding of what her siblings needed to hear. As Elizabeth's story continued, Martha noticed how the children's breathing steadied, how the tension in their small bodies began to ease. Joseph and Daniel took turns adding details to the fantasy kingdom, while even serious Samuel allowed himself small smiles at their more outrageous inventions. Baby Lucy fell asleep in Elizabeth's arms, her tiny fist curled against the fabric of her protector's torn dress. The search outside intensified as afternoon wore toward evening. Voices called more frequently. Horses moved closer to their section of the bluffs, and once Martha heard the distinct sound of brush being pushed aside just yards from their concealed entrance. She raised the rifle, finger on the trigger, while the children pressed deeper into the cave's protective darkness. For long minutes they waited for discovery and death, but the searcher moved on, apparently satisfied that the thick screen of vegetation concealed only solid rock. Martha lowered her weapon with hands that trembled slightly, acknowledging how close they had come to catastrophe. The children's eyes reflected their understanding. Death had passed within arm's reach and somehow missed them. "We should eat something," Martha whispered when the immediate danger receded. "Keep our strength up." She distributed small portions, of jerky and hardtack, adding precious drops of water from her canteen to soften the tough food for younger mouths. The children accepted their rations without complaint, understanding instinctively that supplies were limited. Elizabeth refused her portion initially, insisting the younger ones needed it more, but Martha insisted she eat to maintain her ability to care for baby Lucy. "You can't help them if you collapse from hunger," Martha pointed out practically. "Leadership means taking care of yourself so you can take care of others." As twilight approached, the nature of the search outside began to change. Individual voices became group discussions, horses gathered rather than scattered, and the overall pattern suggested the war party was preparing to withdraw for the night. Martha allowed herself a small measure of hope. Perhaps they had convinced their pursuers that the fleeing children had perished in the creek or had found some other route of escape. "Are they leaving?" Samuel whispered, voicing the question they all wanted to ask. "Maybe," Martha replied carefully. "But we will stay here tonight regardless. Moving in darkness would be too dangerous, even if they've given up the search." The children accepted this wisdom without argument, settling into their small sanctuary for what promised to be a long, uncomfortable night. Martha had them arrange their meager possessions to create the most comfortable sleeping arrangements possible, with older siblings taking responsibility for younger ones. Elizabeth claimed the position closest to the cave entrance, unwilling to place others between herself and potential danger. "I'll take the first watch," Martha told her quietly. "You rest while you can," but Elizabeth shook her head. "I won't sleep tonight anyway. Let me help keep watch. 4 eyes are better than 2. Martha recognized the futility of arguing with someone who had already proven her determination in the crucible of catastrophe. Together, they settled into a routine of shared vigilance, taking turns observing the entrance while the other rested or tended to the children's needs. As full darkness fell outside their refuge, new sounds drifted through the night air, distant voices speaking in unfamiliar rhythms, the crackle of fires being lit, the low murmur of men making camp. The war party had not withdrawn entirely. They had established themselves somewhere nearby, perhaps planning to resume their search with dawn's light. "They're not giving up," Elizabeth observed quietly, her young face grave in the dim light filtering from outside. Martha nodded grimly. "Which means we're not out of danger yet. But we're alive, and that's what matters for now." Baby Lucy stirred restlessly in Elizabeth's arms, making small sounds that seemed impossibly loud in the confined space. Elizabeth began the soft humming that had comforted the infant earlier, a lullaby that spoke of safety and love despite their desperate circumstances. The melody drifted through the cave like a gentle benediction, calming not just the baby, but all the frightened children who had found themselves thrust into a nightmare beyond their comprehension. Outside their hidden sanctuary, night settled over the Texas frontier like a black shroud, concealing both predator and prey in equal darkness. Inside the cave, 8 souls clung to hope and each other, bound together by shared terror and the fierce determination to see another sunrise. The first day of their ordeal was ending, but Martha understood with grim certainty that their trial had only just begun. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new dangers, and new tests of their courage and resourcefulness. But tonight, they were alive and hidden and together. In a world suddenly stripped of certainties, that small victory felt like everything. The second dawn brought no relief from their predicament, only the cruel reminder that freedom lay just beyond reach. Martha woke from an uneasy doze to find Elizabeth already alert, baby Lucy nursing on a rag soaked in sweetened water. The infant's whimpering had grown weaker overnight, and dark circles shadowed Elizabeth's eyes as she struggled to provide adequate nourishment from their dwindling supplies. "She needs real milk," Elizabeth whispered, her voice heavy with worry that went beyond their immediate circumstances. "Or at least something more substantial than sugar water and crumbs." Martha studied the baby's pale face, recognizing the signs of an infant beginning to fail. Lucy Morrison represented more than just another mouth to feed. She was the living embodiment of trust placed in their hands by dying parents, a sacred responsibility that transcended mere survival. Losing her would devastate Elizabeth's already strained emotional reserves. "There might be something we can do," Martha said carefully, her mind racing through possibilities. "But it would mean leaving the cave, at least temporarily." The older boys, Samuel and Daniel, stirred at the mention of venturing outside their sanctuary. During the long night, they had appointed themselves unofficial sentries, taking turns listening at the cave entrance for signs of continued danger. Their vigilance had been rewarded with the disturbing knowledge that their pursuers had indeed established a semi-permanent camp somewhere within a mile of their hiding place. "What kind of something?" Samuel asked, his 13-year-old voice attempting the authority of manhood while betraying the uncertainty of youth. Martha gestured toward the deeper recesses of the cave, where passages led into chambers Thomas had mapped but never fully explored. "Your husband mentioned finding signs that this cave system connects to others in the bluff line. Some of them have water sources, and where there's water. There might be animals coming to drink," Daniel finished, understanding dawning in his bright eyes. "Deer, maybe goats. Something we could. He didn't finish the sentence, but Martha nodded grimly. Hunting meant risk, noise, the possibility of discovery. It also meant fresh meat and, potentially, milk for baby Lucy. The calculation was brutal, but necessary way certain. Slow death against possible swift discovery. Elizabeth's arms tightened protectively around the infant. "I won't let her die because we were too afraid to try." Young Joseph had been exploring the cave's acoustic properties more systematically, mapping how whispers carried between chambers and where sounds seemed to vanish entirely into the stone. His discoveries had practical applications. They now knew which areas offered complete silence and which allowed communication across distances. The boy possessed an intuitive understanding of their environment that impressed Martha with its thoroughness. "Mrs. Caldwell," Joseph said quietly, "there's something back in the third chamber you should see." Martha followed the 9-year-old deeper into the cave system, leaving Elizabeth to manage the other children. The passage narrowed considerably before opening into a smaller chamber, where filtered light revealed something unexpected, evidence of previous human occupation. Not recent, but not ancient either. Charcoal marks on the walls, arranged stones that might once have supported a fire, and carved into the rock face, names and dates. "Look at this one." Joseph pointed to markings near what appeared to be a natural chimney formation. Sarah Chun, 1847, protected by stone until deliverance came. Martha studied the inscription with growing comprehension. This cave had served as a sanctuary before, probably during previous conflicts with Comanche war parties. The dates clustered around periods she knew had been particularly violent along the frontier: 1847, 1851, 1856. Other families had faced similar ordeals and survived them, at least long enough to carve their names into living rock. "There are more," Joseph continued excitedly. "Families, couples, even single names. And look here." He pointed to a more elaborate carving near the chamber's rear wall. "Instructions." The message, carved with obvious care despite crude tools, provided crucial information about the cave system. Water sources in the fourth chamber, an alternate exit through narrow passages that emerged a quarter-mile south, and most importantly, a warning about seasonal flooding that could trap unwary occupants during heavy rains. Martha memorized every detail before returning to the main chamber, where the children waited anxiously. Their small faces turned toward her with expressions that mixed hope and fear in equal measure. She had become their anchor in a world suddenly stripped of all familiar certainties, and they watched her every expression for signs of encouragement or despair. "Good news," she announced quietly. We're not the first people to face this situation. Others have survived here, and they left information that might help us do the same." Elizabeth's relief was palpable. "What kind of information?" Martha explained about the water source and alternate exit, but kept the more disturbing implications to herself. The dates on those carved messages suggested that frontier conflicts followed predictable periods of escalating violence, followed by uneasy peace, then renewed aggression. The current crisis might last days or weeks rather than hours. "We need to think beyond just hiding," Martha continued. "We need to plan for an extended stay, which means securing better food sources and improving our living conditions." Anne, the 8-year-old who had remained largely silent since their arrival, finally spoke up. "Are we going to live here forever?" The question hung in the cave's cool air like smoke from a dying fire. Martha recognized the deeper fear behind those innocent words, not just about their immediate survival, but about what kind of future awaited them, even if they escaped their current predicament. These children had lost everything that defined their lives. Even survival might mean starting over with nothing but the clothes on their backs. "Not forever," Martha assured her gently, "but maybe long enough to let the danger pass and figure out what comes next." Elizabeth's eyes met Martha's over baby Lucy's dark head. In that shared glance, Martha saw understanding beyond the girl's year's recognition that what comes next represented challenges almost as daunting as their current crisis. 7 orphaned children and 1 widowed woman faced a frontier that showed little mercy to the vulnerable or displaced. The conversation was interrupted by sounds from outside their sanctuary, not the organized search patterns of the previous day, but something different. Individual riders moving at speed, horses being driven hard across rough ground, and underneath it all, a rhythmic sound that Martha recognized with growing dread. Drums. "What is that?" Samuel whispered, his face pale in the filtered light. Martha moved to the cave entrance, listening carefully to the complex patterns echoing across the landscape. She had heard similar rhythms during her brief exposure to frontier conflicts, though never this close or this sustained. The drumming spoke of ceremony, of ritual significance that went beyond simple military communication. "Gathering," she said quietly. "They're calling others to join them." The implications sank in gradually as the children processed this new development. Their pursuers were not operating as an isolated war party, but as part of a larger coordinated effort. More warriors were coming, which meant increased pressure to find survivors, expanded search capabilities, and diminished chances of escape. Elizabeth began organizing their limited possessions with renewed urgency, understanding that their window of opportunity was closing rapidly. "How many others might come?" "I don't know," Martha admitted, "but enough to make our situation significantly more dangerous." Little Robert, the youngest boy at 6 years old, had been drawing pictures in the cave's sandy floor using a piece of charcoal from the fire site. His artwork depicted their group as stick figures arranged in a protective circle around a smaller figure that obviously represented baby Lucy. The image was both touching and heartbreaking, a child's attempt to impose order and safety on circumstances beyond anyone's control. "Mickey drew us," Anne observed, using Robert's family nickname. "We look brave." Robert beamed at the praise, then added more figures to his drawing, these ones clearly representing the threat outside their sanctuary. His artistic interpretation showed the good figures inside a circle of protective walls, while the bad figures remained outside, unable to enter. The symbolic representation revealed how completely he trusted the adults to maintain that barrier between safety and danger. Martha studied the child's drawing with fresh eyes, seeing not just naive optimism but practical wisdom. Their cave did represent a barrier, a boundary between 2 different worlds. The challenge lay in maintaining the integrity of that boundary while finding ways to address their mounting needs for food, water, and eventual escape. We need to explore those deeper chambers, she decided. Carefully, quietly, but systematically. If we're going to survive an extended stay, we need to know everything this cave system can offer. Daniel volunteered immediately for the exploration mission, followed by Samuel, despite his obvious preference for remaining near the entrance where he could monitor external threats. Martha chose to take both boys, leaving Elizabeth to manage the younger children while they mapped their expanded sanctuary. The deeper passages proved more extensive than Thomas's initial explorations had suggested. Multiple chambers connected by narrow corridors, with several showing signs of previous occupation. More carved names and dates, evidence of fires, even crude furniture carved from stone or assembled from cave debris. The water source in the fourth chamber was everything the carved instructions had promised, a natural spring emerging from rock fissures, creating a small pool of sweet, clear water. Most importantly, they discovered that the alternate exit was not just theoretical. A series of passages led upward through natural chimneys and narrow corridors, eventually emerging through a crack in the rock face that was invisible from below, but opened onto a ledge overlooking the prairie. The exit was too narrow for comfortable passage, but wide enough for determined escape if their main entrance became compromised. "This changes everything," Samuel observed as they made their way back to the main chamber. "We're not trapped anymore." But Martha remained cautious about raising hopes too high. The alternate exit offered possibilities, not guarantees. It might provide escape routes or simply different ways to die if they were discovered during an attempt to leave. Their situation had improved marginally, but remained desperately precarious. Back in the main chamber, they found Elizabeth teaching the younger children a quiet game involving hand gestures and facial expressions communication, without sound, that served the dual purpose of entertainment and practical skill development. Baby Lucy seemed slightly stronger, though Martha recognized this might represent temporary improvement rather than genuine recovery. "What did you find?" Elizabeth asked as soon as they returned. Martha shared their discoveries carefully, emphasizing possibilities while acknowledging limitations. The children's faces brightened at news of the water source and alternate exit, but she cautioned against premature optimism. Their situation remained extremely dangerous, with new threats developing even as they spoke. The drumming outside continued intermittently throughout the afternoon, joined occasionally by other sounds that suggested significant activity in their vicinity. Horses arriving and departing, voices raised in what sounded like heated discussion, and once, the unmistakable sound of gunfire in the distance. Whatever was happening beyond their cave entrance involved more than a simple search for escaped settlers. As evening approached, Martha made a decision that felt both necessary and terrifying. "Tonight, after full darkness, I'm going to scout our immediate area. We need to know exactly what we're facing." Elizabeth's protest was immediate and emphatic. "You can't leave us here alone. If something happens to you, ... If something happens to me, you follow the passages to the alternate exit and head south toward the trading posts," Martha replied firmly. "But we can't make intelligent decisions without better information about what's out there." The prospect of Martha leaving their sanctuary, even temporarily, clearly terrified the children. She had become their primary source of safety and competence. The adult whose knowledge and determination stood between them and an uncertain fate. But Martha recognized that ignorance posed as great a threat as any external enemy. They needed to understand their tactical situation before it was too late to act on that knowledge. "I'll be careful," she promised. "And I'll be back before dawn, but we have to know what we're dealing with." As darkness settled over the Texas frontier, 8 souls prepared for another night of uncertainty. Their bonds strengthened by shared adversity, but tested by the knowledge that their ordeal was far from over. Outside their hidden sanctuary, forces gathered with purposes that remained hidden but undoubtedly dangerous. While inside, Hope and determination flickered like candle flames in an endless wind. Martha slipped from the cave entrance like a shadow. Given substance, her bare feet finding purchase on stone worn smooth by centuries of weather. The rifle felt familiar in her hands now, no longer the foreign weight it had been during those first desperate practice sessions after Thomas's death. Above her, stars scattered across the Texas sky like salt spilled on black cloth, providing just enough light to navigate the treacherous descent from their rocky sanctuary. The night air carried sounds that made her blood run cold. Not just the occasional drumbeat she'd expected, but voices raised in what sounded almost like celebration. The crackle of multiple fires, and underneath it all, a rhythmic chanting that spoke of ceremony rather than simple military planning. Whatever was happening in the darkness below represented more than a war party resting between raids. Martha had left Elizabeth in charge, with explicit instructions about the alternate exit route, though she suspected the 17-year-old understood the grim mathematics of their situation as well as any adult. If Martha failed to return by dawn, Elizabeth would face an impossible choice: risk 7 children's lives attempting escape through unknown passages, or remain hidden and hope their sanctuary wasn't discovered. Either option carried the probability of death, but at least escape offered the possibility of saving some of them. The descent took longer than expected, requiring absolute silence while navigating loose stone and thorny vegetation in near total darkness. Martha's hands were bloody by the time she reached level ground, torn by unseen brambles and scraped raw against rock faces. But she had successfully moved from the cave system to the prairie floor without detection, positioning herself where she could observe the enemy encampment while remaining concealed in a stand of mesquite. What she saw defied her worst expectations. Comanche camp stretched across nearly a quarter-mile of open ground, with dozens of fires marking individual family groups and warrior societies. Martha counted at least 80 horses picketed in carefully organized lines, suggesting a force far larger than the simple raiding party she'd imagined. This wasn't a group of young warriors seeking glory and plunder. This was a major gathering, with the organizational structure of a formal military expedition. But most disturbing were the captives. 3 makeshift pens had been constructed using rope and wooden stakes, each containing civilians captured during recent raids. Martha recognized clothing styles from various frontier settlements, suggesting the attacks on Whitmore had been part of a coordinated campaign across a wide geographic area. Men, women, and children huddled together in the cramped enclosures, their faces bearing the hollow expressions of people who had witnessed unthinkable horrors. Among them, Martha spotted familiar figures that made her heart sink. Benjamin Porter from the trading post, his wife Rebecca clutching their youngest daughter. The circuit preacher, Reverend Matthews, his normally pristine black coat torn and stained. These were people she knew, had traded with, had shared meals with during community gatherings. Now they sat in enemy captivity while she remained hidden and helpless to assist them. The ceremonial activity centered around a large fire, where a figure Martha assumed to be a war chief addressed the assembled warriors. Even at a distance, his presence was unmistakable: tall, powerfully built, with an authority that commanded absolute attention from his followers. Eagle feathers decorated his hair, and silver ornaments caught firelight as he gestured during his speech. This was no ordinary raid leader, but someone of significant status within Comanche society. Martha strained to catch fragments of the discussion, though the language barrier prevented her from understanding specific words. The tone suggested planning, rather than celebration, strategy sessions for future operations, rather than victory ceremonies for past successes. Maps drawn in the dirt, gestures toward different compass directions, heated debates between various faction leaders, all indicating that the current campaign was far from finished. The realization struck her with devastating clarity. The attack on Whitmore settlement hadn't been an isolated incident, but the opening phase of a larger offensive. More settlements would be targeted, more families killed or captured, more children orphaned or enslaved. The 7 young souls hiding in her cave represented not unique survivors, but the first of many, who would need sanctuary before this conflict ended. Movement near the captive pens caught her attention. Guards were distributing water and what appeared to be dried meat, maintaining their prisoners in reasonably good condition. This suggested the captives had value beyond simple revenge. They would likely be traded, ransomed, or integrated into Comanche society according to tribal customs Martha only vaguely understood. The knowledge provided small comfort, but at least it meant the prisoners weren't doomed to immediate execution. That as Martha prepared to withdraw and return to the cave, a commotion near the war chief's fire stopped her cold. A warrior had approached, with something that made the leader's voice rise in obvious anger. Even without understanding the words, Martha could read the body language, sharp gestures, pointed questions, growing agitation among the assembled men. Whatever news had just arrived was significant and unwelcome. The warrior who had brought the disturbing information pointed repeatedly toward the bluff line where Martha's cave was hidden. Her blood turned to ice as she realized what was happening. Someone had found evidence of their passage, discovered tracks or signs that indicated survivors from Whitmore were hiding in the rock formations. The systematic search that had passed so close to their entrance yesterday was about to be renewed with greater intensity and determination. Martha forced herself to remain motionless despite every instinct screaming at her to flee immediately. Back to the cave. Premature movement might reveal her position, and the information she was gathering could prove crucial for their survival. She watched as the war chief issued rapid orders that sent warriors scattering in multiple directions, some toward the horse lines, others to gather specific equipment. The camp was mobilizing for action that would begin at first light, but then something unexpected happened that changed everything. A lone rider approached the camp from the east, moving at a pace that suggested important news rather than casual arrival. As the figure drew closer to the firelight, Martha realized with shock that this wasn't a Comanche warrior at all. The clothing, the riding style, even the horse's tack suggested a white man, but one who moved through the enemy camp with obvious familiarity and welcome. The newcomer dismounted near the war chief's fire and was immediately embraced like a returning brother. Conversation flowed between them in what appeared to be fluent Comanche, with gestures and expressions indicating long-standing friendship rather than recent alliance. Martha watched in horrified fascination as the two men spread maps in the firelight and began detailed discussions of what could only be attack plans. A renegade, a white man who had thrown his lot in with Comanche raiders, probably providing intelligence about settlement defenses, supply routes, and the locations of isolated homesteads. Such men existed on every frontier. Outcasts, criminals, or simply those who had chosen Indian society over their own culture for personal or practical reasons. But seeing one actively participating in planning attacks on his former people sent revulsion through Martha's entire being. The renegade's information seemed to energize the entire camp. Warriors gathered around the map, pointing and nodding as he indicated specific locations. Martha caught glimpses of the crude drawings and felt her stomach clench with recognition. Those were representations of local settlements, including her own isolated homestead. The man knew the area intimately, could guide attackers to targets they might otherwise never find. But worse than the strategic implications was a growing certainty that the renegade had seen signs of their passage that trained Comanche eyes might have missed. White men knew how white families moved when fleeing danger, understood the likely hiding places and escape routes that frontier settlers might choose. If he suspected survivors from Whitmore were hiding in the bluffs, he would know exactly where to look and how to flush them out. Martha began her careful withdrawal as the camp's activity reached fever pitch around her. Warriors were checking weapons, preparing horses, organizing into groups that would obviously begin coordinated searches at dawn. The reprieve provided by yesterday's unsuccessful hunt was ending, and tomorrow would bring renewed pressure with greatly increased odds of discovery. The return climb to the cave proved even more treacherous in darkness, with the additional burden of urgency driving Martha to take risks she might normally avoid. Twice she dislodged stones that clattered down the bluff face, forcing her to freeze motionless while listening for sounds of alarm from below. But the enemy camp's own noise masked her minor accidents, and she reached the cave entrance without apparent detection. Inside, she found the children exactly as she'd left them, with Elizabeth maintaining a vigilant watch while the younger ones slept in carefully arranged positions that maximized warmth and comfort. Baby Lucy seemed slightly stronger, having managed to consume more of the sweetened water that was their only substitute for proper infant nutrition. But Martha could see the strain in Elizabeth's eyes, the terrible weight of responsibility that kept the girl alert and functional despite obvious exhaustion. "What did you find?" Elizabeth whispered as Martha settled beside her near the cave entrance. Martha weighed her words carefully, balancing honesty with the need to maintain morale. "Larger force than we expected, maybe 80 warriors, possibly more. They're planning to resume searching tomorrow with better information about where to look." Elizabeth absorbed this news with the grim composure that had marked her responses to every crisis since their ordeal began. "How much time do we have?" "Dawn, maybe a little longer if we're lucky." Martha paused, then added the detail that changed everything. "There's a white man with them, someone who knows this area well. That makes our situation significantly more dangerous." The implications sank in gradually as Elizabeth processed what Martha was telling her. A renegade who understood frontier survival tactics would approach their search differently than Comanche warriors operating alone. He might recognize signs that others would miss, might anticipate hiding places that seemed secure against traditional pursuit. "What do you recommend?" Elizabeth asked, and Martha heard in that question the complete trust that made their situation both more precious and more terrifying. 7 children and 1 infant were depending on her judgment for survival against overwhelming odds. "We use the alternate exit," Martha decided. "Before dawn, while they're still planning rather than searching. Move south toward the trading posts and hope we can reach help before they realize we've escaped." Elizabeth nodded slowly, then asked the question that had been haunting Martha throughout her return journey. "And if we can't make it? If they catch us in the open?" Martha met the girl's eyes steadily. "Then we make them pay dearly for it." The remainder of the night passed in careful preparation for their desperate escape attempt. Martha and Elizabeth worked together to organize their meager supplies for maximum portability, while the older boys were quietly awakened and briefed on the plan. Each child would carry specific items, with the strongest taking responsibility for helping the youngest navigate the difficult passages leading to their alternate exit. Baby Lucy presented the greatest challenge, requiring constant attention, while producing sounds that might reveal their position during the most critical phases of escape. Elizabeth had fashioned a crude sling from torn fabric that would allow her to carry the infant while keeping both hands free for climbing. The arrangement was far from ideal, but represented their best compromise between mobility and infant. As false dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, Martha made her final preparations for leading 8 vulnerable souls through passages she had explored only briefly, toward an exit she had seen but never used, into a landscape now swarming with enemies who had every advantage except knowledge of their exact location. The odds were terrible, the risks enormous, but remaining in their sanctuary had become equally dangerous. "Stay close, stay quiet, and trust each other," she whispered to the children as they prepared to leave their cave sanctuary forever. "We're going to survive this together." Outside their hidden refuge, the Texas frontier stirred with renewed purpose as warriors prepared for a hunt that would determine whether 7 orphaned children and 1 determined woman would live to see another sunset. The final test of their courage and resourcefulness was about to begin. The first pale light of dawn crept through the cave entrance like unwelcome news, illuminating 8 faces marked by exhaustion and determination in equal measure. Martha had roused the children while stars still dominated the sky, allowing precious minutes for final preparations before their desperate escape attempt. Each child now carried a carefully distributed portion of their supplies, with even 6-year-old Robert shouldering a small pack containing dried food and essential items. Elizabeth cradled baby Lucy in the improvised sling, testing its security. One final time before they committed to passages that would offer no opportunity for adjustment. The infant had remained mercifully quiet during their preparations, as if sensing the gravity of their situation through some primal instinct that transcended understanding. Her dark eyes tracked movements with unusual alertness for such a young child. "Remember the sequence," Martha whispered as they gathered at the entrance to the deeper passages. "Third chamber, down through the narrow corridor, up through the chimney passage, then follow the water sounds to the exit. Stay together, help each other, and if we get separated, keep moving toward the sound of running water." Samuel and Daniel, the 2 oldest boys, positioned themselves at the front and rear of their small procession, understanding without being told that they would serve as early warning scouts and rearguard respectively. Their young faces carried expressions far too serious for their ages, but Martha felt grateful for their maturity rather than lamenting its premature necessity. The passage through familiar chambers proceeded smoothly at first. Joseph led them confidently through sections he had mapped during their extended stay, his small form navigating obstacles with the grace of someone who had made these routes his personal domain. Anne followed close behind, her 8-year-old determination evident in every careful step across uneven cave floors. But as they approached the narrow corridor leading toward their escape route, sounds from outside filtered through stone walls with alarming clarity. Voices calling in coordination, horses moving at organized patterns rather than random patrol, and most ominously, the distinctive echo of human feet on stone that suggested searchers had begun exploring the bluff face itself. "They're starting." Early, Martha realized with growing dread. The enemy's systematic approach was beginning hours before she had anticipated, compressed by intelligence that had focused their search on the exact area where her cave system lay hidden. The renegade's knowledge was proving as dangerous as she had feared. Elizabeth shifted baby Lucy to a more secure position as they approached the challenging portion of their escape route. The narrow corridor required single-file movement through spaces barely wide enough for adult shoulders, with uneven footing that demanded complete attention to avoid injury-causing falls. Martha had traveled this route only once before, during her exploration with the boys, and then under much less stressful circumstances. "I'll go first," Martha decided, then Elizabeth with the baby, then the youngest children, with Samuel and Daniel bringing up the rear. "If anyone gets stuck or has trouble, speak up immediately. We can't afford to have someone struggling in silence." The corridor proved even more challenging than memory had suggested. Stone walls pressed close on both sides, forcing them to move sideways in some sections while ducking beneath low overhangs that seemed designed to catch unwary heads. Martha's rifle, essential for their protection but awkward in confined spaces, repeatedly snagged on projecting rocks and required constant repositioning. Behind her, she could hear Elizabeth's quiet encouragement to the younger children, her voice maintaining steady calm despite the obvious difficulty of maneuvering through tight spaces while protecting an infant. The girl's leadership had evolved beyond mere competence into something approaching genius, as she somehow managed to keep 7 children focused and moving, despite circumstances that would challenge experienced adults. Little Michael proved unexpectedly adept at the narrow passages, his small size becoming an advantage for the first time during their ordeal. He squeezed through openings that forced the others to struggle, then turned back to offer assistance and encouragement to those following behind. His quiet confidence seemed to spread among the group, providing psychological support that proved as valuable as physical help. The chimney passage presented their greatest challenge yet. Natural stone formations created a vertical shaft that required climbing skills none of them possessed, with handholds that were often wet with seepage and footing that consisted mainly of narrow ledges worn smooth by countless years of water flow. Martha tested each grip carefully before committing her weight, acutely aware that a fall here could injure her severely enough to doom their entire escape attempt. "Take your time," she called softly to those below. "Better slow and safe than fast and careless." But even as she spoke, new sounds filtered down from above, voices much closer than before, accompanied by the scrape of equipment against stone that suggested searchers were beginning to explore the bluff line itself. The systematic approach Martha had observed during her nighttime reconnaissance was proceeding exactly as planned, with teams of warriors examining every possible hiding place. Elizabeth managed the climb with baby Lucy secured against her chest, displaying a combination of strength and grace that left Martha impressed despite their desperate circumstances. The sling arrangement held perfectly, keeping the infant secure while allowing Elizabeth to use both hands for the treacherous ascent. Behind her, the children followed with varying degrees of difficulty, helping each other when grips proved challenging or courage faltered. Young Robert required the most assistance, his 6-year-old limbs barely long enough to span the distances between reliable handholds. Samuel, climbing just below him, provided a steady presence and physical support when needed, while Daniel maintained watch below for signs that their escape route had been discovered. The coordination between siblings spoke of family bonds strengthened, rather than broken by their shared trauma. As they neared the top of the chimney passage, natural light began filtering down from the exit above, pale dawn illumination that promised freedom but also increased visibility once they emerged onto the bluff face. Martha paused just below the opening, listening carefully for sounds that might indicate enemy presence in their immediate vicinity. The exit proved to be everything the carved instructions had promised: a narrow crack in the stone face that opened onto a ledge barely wide enough for 2 people to stand comfortably. Below them stretched the prairie landscape, bathed in gray dawn light that revealed far too much activity for comfort. Smoke rose from the enemy encampment, horses moved in organized patterns, and small groups of warriors could be seen beginning their methodical search of the surrounding terrain. But most alarming was movement much closer to their position. 3 Comanche warriors were climbing the bluff face perhaps 200 yards to their north, following what appeared to be a game trail that would bring them within sight of the cave entrance within the hour. The systematic search was proceeding with military precision, and their former sanctuary would soon be discovered and explored. "We need to move immediately," Martha whispered as the children joined her on the narrow ledge. "Stay low, stay quiet, and follow me exactly. We're going to work our way south along the bluff face until we find a safe descent route." The ledge system proved more extensive than their initial view had suggested, with natural pathways carved by water and weather that allowed lateral movement along the rock face. But progress was slow and terrifying, with drops that would prove fatal for anyone who lost their footing. Martha found herself constantly torn between the need for speed and the absolute requirement for safety. Elizabeth continued to demonstrate remarkable competence under pressure, somehow managing to navigate treacherous footing while protecting baby Lucy and providing guidance to her younger siblings. The girl had discovered reserves of courage and capability that transformed her from victim into protector, from child into leader worthy of the trust placed in her by desperate circumstances. Behind them, the search of their former hideout had begun in earnest. Voices echoed from the cave entrance as warriors explored the chambers where they had spent 3 days in relative safety. Martha could only hope that the evidence of their presence would be attributed to previous refugees rather than recent occupation. But she held little faith in such optimistic interpretations. The ledge system eventually connected to a steep but navigable descent route that would bring them to ground level approximately half a mile south of the cave entrance. But as they prepared to begin the final phase of their escape, movement in the prairie below caught Martha's attention and filled her with fresh dread. A line of mounted warriors was moving parallel to the bluff face, positioned to intercept anyone attempting to flee the rock formations. The enemy commander had anticipated the possibility of escape routes and positioned forces accordingly. Their descent would place them directly in the path of a patrol that appeared to be sweeping the area systematically. "We're trapped," Samuel observed quietly, his 13-year-old voice carrying the flat acceptance of someone who had learned to face hard truths without flinching. Martha studied the tactical situation with growing desperation. Remaining on the ledge meant eventual discovery by the searchers working their way through the cave system. Descending meant immediate confrontation with mounted warriors who possessed every advantage of mobility, numbers, and weaponry. Neither option offered realistic hope of survival. But then baby Lucy made the decision for them. The infant, perhaps sensing the tension radiating from her protectors, began to cry with the lusty determination of a healthy child demanding attention. The sound echoed off the rock faces with startling clarity, immediately drawing attention from the mounted patrol below. Shouts in Comanche rose from the prairie as warriors pointed toward their position and began spurring their horses toward the base of the bluff. "Down the slope," Martha ordered, abandoning stealth for speed. "Fast as you can manage without falling. We'll have to fight our way through." The descent became a controlled fall as they abandoned caution in favor of velocity. Martha led the way, using her rifle as a balance pole while half sliding down sections of loose scree and weathered stone. Behind her, the children followed with the reckless courage of youth, helping each other when footing gave way and maintaining their protective formation around Elizabeth and baby Lucy. The first arrows began striking the rock face around them. When they were still 50 feet above ground level, Martha could hear the mounted warriors calling to each other as they positioned themselves to surround the base of their descent route. The tactical situation was hopeless. 8 people on foot, including 7 children and an infant, attempting to break through a cordon of mounted warriors in open terrain. But Martha had not survived 3 years, alone on the frontier by accepting impossible odds without resistance. As they reached the final 20 feet of descent, she began firing methodically at the closest mounted warriors, forcing them to take cover and disrupting their coordination. Her shots were deliberate and accurate, driven by skills honed through countless hours of practice and sharpened by the desperate knowledge that missing meant death for everyone under her protection. When we reached the bottom, she called to Elizabeth, "Head for that stand of cottonwoods by the creek. I'll hold them off as long as possible." But Elizabeth's response revealed the depth of character that had carried her through their entire ordeal. "We stay together," she said firmly. "All of us or none of us." The final moments of their descent played out in a confusion of gunfire, shouting, and desperate movement. Martha's rifle spoke repeatedly as she covered their approach to ground level, while the children moved with coordinated purpose toward the dubious shelter of the creek bottom. Baby Lucy's crying had become a battle cry that seemed to inspire rather than hinder their desperate flight. And then, just as capture seemed inevitable, salvation appeared from an unexpected direction. The renegade white man Martha had observed in the enemy camp came riding hard from the north, but instead of joining the pursuit, he was shouting orders that caused the Comanche warriors to cease their attack and fall back. His words were lost in the confusion of the moment, but his authority was absolute. The warriors obeyed immediately, allowing Martha and the children to reach the temporary Safety of the creek bed. As they caught their breath in the shallow water, Martha found herself face to face with the man she had assumed was their enemy. But his next words shattered every assumption about their situation and changed everything about what she thought she understood. "Mrs. Caldwell," he said in accented but clear English, "my name is Running Wolf, and I've been looking for you and these children for 3 days. We need to talk." Martha kept her rifle trained on the man who called himself Running Wolf, despite the confusion swirling through her mind like dust in a whirlwind. Everything about their situation had shifted in an instant, but 3 days of mortal terror couldn't be dismissed by a few words spoken in English. The children clustered behind her in the shallow creek water, Elizabeth clutching baby Lucy while the boys positioned themselves to protect their younger siblings. "You'll forgive me if I don't immediately trust a man I saw planning attacks with." "Comanche war chiefs," Martha said, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. "Whatever game you're playing, we won't be part of it." Running Wolf slowly raised his hands, showing he carried no immediate weapons. His appearance was a strange mixture of Comanche clothing and ornaments, but facial features and mannerisms that spoke of European heritage. War paint had been applied with expert precision, but couldn't completely disguise the pale skin beneath, or the blue eyes that marked him as something other than what he appeared. "I understand your suspicion, Mrs. Caldwell, but we have very little time before others arrive who won't be as interested in conversation. My name was Jonathan Marshall before I became Running Wolf. I've been living with Chief Stone Bear's band for 8 years, but not by choice. I was captured as a boy during raids in Arkansas, adopted into the tribe, and have been searching for an opportunity to help other captives ever since." The warriors who had been pursuing them maintained their distance, but Martha could see more riders approaching from multiple directions. Whatever protection Running Wolf's authority provided would be temporary at best. The tactical situation remained desperately precarious despite this unexpected development. "Even if that's true," Elizabeth interjected, surprising everyone with her directness, "how does that help us? We're still surrounded by people who want us dead or captured." Wolf's expression grew grave as he studied the exhausted children gathered in the creek bed. "Chief Stone Bear's War Council believes all the Whitmore settlers were killed during the initial attack. They don't know survivors escaped, and some of the younger war chiefs want to keep it that way. If they discover you're alive, they'll demand your capture to prevent you from warning other settlements about their plans." Martha processed this information while keeping constant watch on the mounted warriors surrounding their position. "And you're suggesting we trust you to protect us from your own adopted people?" "I'm suggesting you let me take you to Chief Stone Bear himself," Running Wolf replied. "He's not the monster you probably imagine. His decisions are driven by desperation, not cruelty. His people are being pushed from their traditional lands by settlers and soldiers. The raids are his way of fighting back against forces that threaten his tribe's survival." Samuel, the oldest boy, spoke up with the practical wisdom that had marked his behavior throughout their ordeal. "Even if this chief is reasonable, what's to stop the other warriors from killing us the moment they see us?" Running Wolf gestured toward the approaching riders, his urgency becoming more apparent with each passing second. "Because I'm going to tell them you're my captives, taken during the initial raid and kept hidden while I decided what to do with you. That gives us protection under tribal law until we can reach Stone Bear and explain the real situation." The plan sounded desperate and dangerous, but Martha recognized they had few alternatives. Remaining in the creek bed meant eventual capture by warriors less sympathetic than Running Wolf. Attempting to flee on foot across open prairie would result in quick pursuit and certain death. At least Running Wolf's proposal offered some small chance of survival. "What guarantee do we have that this isn't elaborate revenge?" Martha asked. "How do we know you won't deliver us directly to torture and death?" Wolf's face showed genuine pain at the question. "Because 8 years ago, I was in exactly your position. captured, terrified, certain I was going to die. But Chief Stone Bear chose mercy instead of vengeance, and I've been alive ever since. Not free, but alive. Sometimes that's the best option available. Elizabeth shifted baby Lucy to a more secure position, her young face showing the burden of making adult decisions under impossible circumstances. If we agree to this, what happens to us afterward? Even if your chief spares our lives, we'll still be prisoners. Not necessarily, Running Wolf replied. Stone Bear has been known to adopt captives into the tribe, especially children. You would have to learn new ways, new customs, but you would live. And eventually, when the current conflicts end, there might be opportunities for exchange or escape. The prospect of living as adopted Comanche was hardly appealing, but Martha recognized it represented a vast improvement over immediate death. More importantly, it offered time-precious days or weeks during which circumstances might change, opportunities might arise, or rescue might somehow materialize. Little Robert, who had remained silent throughout their desperate flight, suddenly tugged on Martha's sleeve. Mrs. Caldwell, are we going to be Indians now? The innocent question struck everyone like a physical blow, highlighting the profound transformation their lives had undergone in just 3 days. These children had lost everything that defined their existence: family, home, culture, future. Now they faced the possibility of losing even their identities, becoming something entirely different just to survive. We're going to do whatever we must to stay alive, Martha told him gently. And we're going to stay together no matter what happens. Running Wolf nodded approvingly at her response. That's exactly the right attitude. Stone Bear values loyalty and courage above all else. If you demonstrate those qualities, you'll earn his respect regardless of your origins. The sound of approaching horses grew louder, forcing a decision Martha wasn't ready to make. But as she looked at the 8 precious lives depending on her judgment, she realized that uncertainty was preferable to certain death. They would have to trust this strange man who claimed to be their salvation. We'll come with you, she decided. But understand this, if you betray us, if this is some cruel deception, I'll find a way to make you regret it before I die. Running Wolf's smile held both admiration and sadness. Mrs. Caldwell, if I were planning to betray you, I would have simply let the other warriors capture you 5 minutes ago. The fact that we're having this conversation proves my intentions. The next few hours passed in a blur of careful performance and controlled terror. Running Wolf orchestrated an elaborate charade in which Martha and the children were presented as his personal captives, taken during the Whitmore raid and kept hidden while he decided their fate. The deception required perfect cooperation from all 8 refugees, especially the younger children who had to appear properly cowed without actually being mistreated. Elizabeth proved particularly adept at the masquerade, somehow managing to project submission while maintaining her protective authority over her siblings. She kept baby Lucy quiet through a combination of gentle rocking and softly hummed lullabies, presenting the image of a defeated but not broken young woman. The performance was so convincing that Martha herself sometimes forgot it was an act. Journey to Chief Stone Bear's main camp took most of the day, traveling across prairie landscape that showed the scars of recent conflict. Burned homesteads dotted the horizon like blackened teeth, while scattered debris marked the sites of wagon trains that had failed to reach their destinations. The evidence of systematic warfare was overwhelming, suggesting that the attack on Whitmore had been part of a much larger campaign. But Martha also noticed signs that complicated her understanding of the conflict. Abandoned military equipment indicated that soldiers had been operating in the area, probably pursuing Comanche bands with orders that didn't distinguish between hostile warriors and peaceful families. The frontier war was clearly more complex than simple raids on innocent settlers. Chief Stone Bear's camp proved to be a substantial settlement rather than a temporary military position. Hundreds of tipis arranged in careful patterns, extensive horse herds, and the organized activity of a community rather than just a war party. Women worked at various domestic tasks while children played under the watchful eyes of grandparents. This was a society fighting for survival, not a group of savage raiders. Stone Bear himself defied every stereotype Martha had absorbed about Comanche leaders. Probably in his 50s, he carried himself with quiet dignity rather than fierce intimidation. His face showed intelligence and weariness in equal measure, the expression of someone who had been forced to make terrible decisions for the good of his people. When Running Wolf presented Martha and the children as his captives, Stone Bear studied them with penetrating but not unkind eyes. The conversation that followed took place entirely in Comanche, with Running Wolf serving as translator. For the crucial portions, Stone Bear's questions were probing but not hostile, focusing on practical matters like the children's skills, health, and adaptability rather than their origins or potential for causing trouble. Martha began to understand that they were being evaluated as potential additions to the tribe rather than temporary prisoners. "He wants to know why you stayed with the children instead of fleeing alone," Running Wolf translated. "Your chances of escape would have been much better without them." Martha met Stone Bear's gaze directly as she answered, "Because abandoning children to save myself would have made me something less than human. These children are my responsibility now, and I won't betray that trust." Stone Bear's expression shifted subtly as Running Wolf conveyed her response. The chief spoke again, his tone carrying what sounded like approval mixed with curiosity. "He says you think like a Comanche mother." Running Wolf translated, "That protecting children is more important than personal safety. He's impressed by your courage." Elizabeth stepped forward slightly, still maintaining her submissive posture, but showing the quiet strength that had carried them through their ordeal. "Tell him we're grateful for his mercy, and that we'll work hard to earn our place here if he allows us to stay." The translation sparked a longer conversation between Running Wolf and Stone Bear, with several other tribal leaders joining the discussion. Martha watched the interplay of personalities and politics, recognizing the complexity of decision-making in a society where consensus mattered more than individual authority. Their fate was being debated by people who understood the long-term implications better than she could imagine. Finally, Stone Bear spoke directly to Martha, his words requiring no translation despite the language barrier. His tone carried finality, but also something that might have been kindness. Running Wolf's translation confirmed what she had hoped to hear. "You and the children are welcome to remain with us. You'll be assigned to families who will teach you our ways and help you adapt to your new lives. The adoption process will take time, but if you prove yourselves worthy, you'll eventually be considered full members of the tribe." Martha felt a complex mixture of relief, gratitude, and loss as she absorbed this news. They would live, but at the cost of everything they had been before. The children would grow up as Comanche, learning different languages, customs, and values. They might eventually forget their original identities entirely, becoming something their dead parents could never have imagined, but they would be alive. And in a world that had shown them precious little mercy, that represented a victory worth celebrating. The weeks that followed blurred together in a constant process of learning and adaptation. Martha found herself assigned to the household of Stone Bear's sister, an older woman named Singing Bird who possessed infinite patience for teaching frontier customs to bewildered refugees. The children were distributed among different families, maintaining contact but beginning the gradual process of integration into their new society. Elizabeth thrived in ways that surprised everyone, including herself. Her natural leadership abilities translated well to Comanche culture, where capable women wielded significant influence within their families and communities. Baby Lucy was formally adopted by a couple who had lost their own infant, but Elizabeth remained involved in her care as an older sister figure. The boys adapted with the resilience of youth, learning to ride horses, hunt game, and speak Comanche. with increasing fluency. Samuel, in particular, showed aptitude for the warrior skills that would eventually allow him to earn respect within the tribe. Daniel discovered a talent for working with horses that made him valuable despite his young age. Little Anne and Robert required the most careful attention, being young enough to adapt completely, but old enough to remember their previous lives. Their new families provided constant affection and guidance, gradually replacing traumatic memories with experiences of safety and belonging. They began to laugh again, to play with other children, to imagine futures that extended beyond mere survival. Martha's own adaptation proved more challenging but ultimately rewarding. Her frontier skills translated well to Comanche life, and her fierce protectiveness of the children earned respect from tribal members who valued loyalty above all else. She learned to tan hides, prepare traditional foods, and participate in the complex social networks that bound the community together. Running Wolf became their primary connection to their former lives, serving as translator and cultural interpreter during the difficult early months. His own story emerged gradually captured at age 12 during a raid in Arkansas. He had spent 8 years walking the narrow line between survival and betrayal, helping his adopted people while secretly aiding other captives when possible. Their rescue had been his most ambitious effort yet. "I've been waiting for an opportunity like this," he confided to Martha during one of their conversations. "A chance to prove that mercy can be stronger than vengeance, that understanding might eventually replace hatred." But the larger conflict continued around them, with raids and counter-raids marking the ongoing struggle between expanding settlement and indigenous resistance. Martha learned to see both sides of the violence, understanding how desperation and fear drove good people to commit terrible acts. The frontier war wasn't a simple story of civilization versus savagery, but a complex tragedy where everyone was both victim and perpetrator. 6 months after their capture, unexpected news arrived that changed everything once again. A wagon train of missionaries had established contact with Stone Bear's band, seeking permission to travel through Comanche territory on their way to establish a school for Indian children. Among the missionaries was a woman named Sarah Hutchinson, whose brother had been killed in the Whitmore Massacre. The reunion was emotional and complicated, bringing the outside world crashing back into lives that had found new equilibrium. Sarah carried letters from relatives, news of the ongoing war, and most importantly, official pardon papers for any settlers who might have been captured rather than killed during recent raids. The government was finally acknowledging that some captives might have survived and offering safe passage to anyone who wished to return to white society. The choice was agonizing for everyone involved. Martha and the children had built new lives, formed new relationships, and begun to think of themselves as members of the Comanche community. Leaving would mean abandoning people who had shown them kindness when they had every reason to seek revenge. But staying would mean accepting permanent exile from their original culture and families. Elizabeth made her decision first, choosing to remain with the tribe that had become her home. Her bonds with her Comanche family were too strong to break, and her role within the community too important to abandon. Baby Lucy would stay as well, having been legally adopted and truly belonging to her new parents. Samuel and Daniel chose differently, deciding to return to white society with hopes of eventually joining the cavalry and fighting to end the frontier conflicts through military service. Their experiences with the Comanche had given them unique perspectives that might prove valuable in future negotiations. Anne and Robert, still young enough to adapt either way, were given the choice between staying with their adoptive families or returning with Martha to attempt rebuilding their former lives. Both chose to stay, having found love and security that transcended cultural boundaries. Martha faced the most difficult decision of all. Her heart was torn between loyalty to her new community and longing for the life she had lost. Stone Bear himself offered counsel, speaking through Running Wolf with the wisdom of someone who had faced similar choices many times. He says the measure of a person isn't where they choose to live, but how much love they carry with them wherever they go. Running Wolf translated. You've become part of our family now, regardless of what decision you make. That bond doesn't break just because you cross back to the other side of an invisible line. In the end, Martha chose to return to white society, but with a mission that would define the rest of her life. She would use her unique experiences to work for peace between the warring cultures, carrying messages between communities and advocating for understanding rather than revenge. Running Wolf decided to accompany her, finally taking the opportunity to return to his original world while maintaining connections to his adopted one. The farewell ceremony was both heartbreaking and beautiful, acknowledging that love transcends cultural boundaries and that family can be chosen as well as inherited. The children who stayed would carry forward the lessons of courage and loyalty they had learned during their ordeal, while those who left would remember that humanity exists in all societies, even those labeled as enemies. Martha's return to the frontier settlements brought her unexpected recognition as someone who had survived the unsurvivable and learned truths that few others could understand. Her testimony about Comanche culture and the complexity of frontier conflicts influenced government policy and helped save numerous lives on both sides of the ongoing war. She established a small ranch near the ruins of her original homestead, creating a sanctuary for other survivors and refugees, regardless of their origins. Elizabeth visited occasionally, bringing news of the children who had chosen to remain with the tribe, and maintaining the bonds that had been forged in darkness, but strengthened by love. Years later, when peace finally came to the frontier and the Comanche Wars ended in treaties rather than total destruction, Martha could look back on her choices with satisfaction. She had saved 8 lives when survival seemed impossible, had learned that courage sometimes means embracing change rather than resisting it, and had discovered that love is stronger than fear, mercy more powerful than vengeance. The cave where they had hidden during those desperate days became a landmark of sorts, visited by travelers who had heard the story of the woman who sheltered 7 children from massacre and found salvation in the most unexpected places. Local settlers marked the entrance with a stone cairn, but Martha preferred the memorial carved into the cave walls by the children, themselves simple stick figures holding hands in an unbroken circle, with words scratched beneath. Love binds us together, always. In the end, their story became more than just a tale of survival. It became a testament to the possibility of finding family in the darkest moments, of discovering that humanity exists in all cultures, and of learning that sometimes the greatest courage lies not in fighting your enemies, but in accepting their mercy and returning it with understanding. The frontier that had seemed determined to destroy them had instead transformed them into bridges between worlds, carrying messages of hope across the vast and dangerous spaces where different people struggled to coexist. The children grew up to become leaders, teachers, warriors, and peacemakers, carrying forward the lessons they had learned in a hidden cave where fear gave way to love and strangers became family. Their story lived on in the oral traditions of both cultures, a reminder that even in humanity's darkest hours, the light of compassion can illuminate paths toward redemption and healing. The integration process proved far more complex than anyone had anticipated, revealing layers of cultural difference that went beyond language and customs to touch the very foundations of how people understood their place in the world. Martha found herself constantly navigating between her ingrained frontier pragmatism and the deeply spiritual worldview that permeated every aspect of Comanche life. Simple tasks like preparing food became lessons in philosophy, as Singing Bird explained the sacred relationships between humans, animals, and the natural forces that sustained all life. Elizabeth's adaptation proceeded along different lines entirely. Her natural intelligence and leadership qualities made her particularly valuable to the Tribal Council of Women, who wielded significant influence over community decisions. Unlike white society, where women's roles were largely confined to domestic spheres, Comanche culture recognized female wisdom as essential to tribal survival. Elizabeth found herself consulted on matters ranging from resource allocation to conflict resolution, her outsider's perspective often providing insights that tribal members couldn't achieve alone. The linguistic challenges proved both frustrating and fascinating. Comanche possessed conceptual frameworks that had no equivalent in English, forcing Martha and the children to literally think in new ways about time, space, relationships, and identity. The language distinguished between different types of kinship bonds, various categories of spiritual connection, and subtle gradations of social obligation that English compressed into inadequate generalizations. Baby Lucy's complete immersion in Comanche culture from infancy made her adaptation the most seamless but also the most profound. By her second birthday, she spoke only Comanche and related to the world through entirely indigenous concepts of family, community, and spiritual connection. Her adoptive parents, Soaring Eagle and Gentle Rain, treated her exactly as they would their own biological child, but also honored her original heritage through stories and ceremonies that acknowledged her unique journey to their family. Samuel's path toward becoming a Comanche warrior required him to undergo training that challenged every assumption he'd held about courage, strength, and masculinity. The physical demands were enormous, learning to ride horses at full gallop while shooting arrows with deadly accuracy, developing the endurance to travel hundreds of miles across harsh terrain, mastering hand-to-hand combat techniques that emphasize speed and agility over brute force. But the psychological transformation proved even more demanding. Comanche warriors were expected to demonstrate not just physical prowess, but spiritual discipline, emotional control, and deep understanding of their responsibilities to the community. Samuel learned to fast for days while maintaining peak performance, to interpret natural signs that revealed weather patterns and animal movements, to make split-second tactical decisions that could mean life or death for entire hunting parties. His white upbringing had taught him to think of warfare as organized conflict between opposing armies, but Comanche military culture emphasized individual excellence within coordinated group efforts. Daniel's fascination with horses led him into the intricate world of Comanche animal husbandry, where the relationship between human and horse transcended simple utility to become a form of spiritual partnership. He learned to read equine psychology with the precision of a natural scientist, understanding how different horses responded to various training techniques, how breeding decisions could influence temperament and capability across generations, how the health and happiness of the horse herds directly affected the tribe's ability to survive and prosper. The boy who had once helped his father tend a few farm animals in Arkansas became a master horseman whose skills were respected even by tribal elders who had spent their entire lives perfecting the same arts. Daniel could gentle in wild mustangs through patient persistence, diagnose and treat equine illnesses that baffled less experienced handlers, and coordinate the complex logistics of moving hundreds of horses across challenging terrain during seasonal migrations. Anne and Robert's complete integration into Comanche childhood culture provided perhaps the most poignant evidence of human adaptability. Within months of their arrival, they were playing traditional games, learning tribal stories, and participating in ceremonies with the unself-conscious enthusiasm that marked them as truly accepted community members. Their adoptive families surrounded them with love and security that gradually erased the trauma of their original losses, replacing fear with confidence and despair with hope. But Martha observed that even complete cultural assimilation couldn't entirely eliminate the psychological scars left by witnessing their parents' deaths. Both children occasionally suffered nightmares that required careful attention from tribal healers who specialized in treating spiritual wounds. The Comanche understanding of trauma as a form of soul injury that required ceremonial healing proved more effective than any frontier remedies Martha had known. Running Wolf's role within the community grew increasingly complex as his linguistic abilities and bicultural knowledge made him invaluable for negotiations with other tribes, trading, expeditions, and the delicate diplomatic contacts that were becoming necessary as white settlement pressure intensified. His unique position also made him suspect to some tribal members who questioned whether anyone could truly serve two cultures simultaneously, without ultimately betraying both. Martha witnessed firsthand the internal debates that raged within Comanche society about how to respond to the expanding white presence. Some leaders advocated for complete resistance, arguing that any compromise would inevitably lead to their people's destruction. Others sought accommodation through negotiated agreements that might preserve tribal autonomy within defined territories. Still others proposed strategic alliances with white factions that opposed unlimited territorial expansion. Chief Stone Bear himself seemed torn between his protective instincts toward his people and his recognition that the old ways of life were becoming impossible to maintain. He confided to Martha, through Running Wolf's translation, that the buffalo herds were declining rapidly due to commercial hunting, that traditional hunting grounds were being occupied by permanent settlements, and that intertribal conflicts were being exacerbated by competition for shrinking resources. He says the world is changing faster than wisdom can adapt, Running Wolf explained after one particularly intense council session. The decisions being made today will determine whether his grandchildren live as free Comanche or as something else entirely. Martha's own evolution during this period surprised her with its depth and complexity. The woman who had initially focused solely on immediate survival found herself thinking in terms of decades and generations, considering how the choices made during this crisis would affect not just her own life, but the lives of countless others who would inherit the consequences. Her perspective on the frontier conflicts shifted from personal tragedy to historical inevitability. Though this broader understanding brought sorrow rather than acceptance. She began documenting her experiences in a journal that would eventually become one of the most important first-hand accounts of Comanche culture ever recorded by an outsider. Her observations covered everything from domestic practices and spiritual beliefs to military tactics and political structures, providing insights that would prove invaluable to historians and anthropologists for generations to come. But the journal also served a more immediate purpose, helping her process the psychological transformation she was undergoing as her identity evolved from frontier widow to bicultural bridge-builder. The seasonal cycle of Comanche life required constant adaptation to changing environmental conditions, with the entire community moving several times each year to follow game migrations, seek better grazing for the horse herds, and avoid conflicts with other tribes or military forces. Martha learned to pack and unpack an entire household in less than an hour, to identify suitable camping spots based on water access and defensive positioning, to coordinate the complex logistics of moving hundreds of people and thousands of animals across vast distances. These migrations revealed the sophisticated environmental knowledge that underlay Comanche survival strategies. Tribal elders possessed detailed mental maps of water sources, seasonal weather patterns, and ecological relationships across thousands of square miles of territory. They could predict drought conditions months in advance, locate hidden springs during the driest seasons, and identify subtle signs that warned of approaching severe weather. Martha realized that her own frontier survival skills, which she had considered comprehensive, represented only a fraction of what was necessary for true mastery of the plains. Environment. The children's educational experiences within Comanche society differed dramatically from anything they would have received in white settlements. Instead of formal schooling focused on literacy and arithmetic, they learned through observation, participation, and storytelling that conveyed practical skills alongside cultural values. Elizabeth mastered complex beadwork patterns that encoded tribal history, learned herbal medicine techniques that had been refined over generations, and developed diplomatic skills through participation in women's councils that resolved community disputes. Samuel's warrior training included lessons in astronomy that enabled navigation across featureless terrain, ecology instruction that revealed the interconnections between all living things, and psychology education that taught him to read human nature with the precision necessary for successful leadership. His education was holistic in ways that white society rarely achieved, integrating physical, intellectual, emotional, and spiritual development into a comprehensive program designed to create well-rounded adults capable of serving their communities' needs. The arrival of winter brought particular challenges that tested everyone's adaptation to their new circumstances. Comanche winter camps required different skills and social arrangements than the mobile summer lifestyle, with extended periods of close community living that could either strengthen bonds or create explosive tensions. Martha learned to contribute to the complex network of mutual obligations that ensured everyone's survival during the harsh months, when travel was impossible and resources were scarce. She also discovered that winter was the season for extended storytelling, when tribal elders passed down the oral histories that preserved Comanche culture across generations. These narratives weren't simply entertainment, but sophisticated educational tools that conveyed practical knowledge, moral instruction, and cultural identity through memorable stories that could be accurately transmitted without written records. Martha found herself both audience and eventual contributor to this tradition. As her own experiences began to be incorporated into the tribal oral history, the spiritual dimensions of Comanche life initially challenged Martha's Presbyterian upbringing, but she gradually came to appreciate the profound connection between indigenous religious practices and the practical requirements of plain survival. Ceremonies that appeared to be simple superstition revealed themselves as sophisticated psychological tools for maintaining group cohesion, processing trauma, and making collective decisions under extreme stress. The vision quests, ritual purifications, and communal prayers that marked important transitions served functions that white society attempted to achieve through separate institutions, churches, schools, courts, and medical establishments. Elizabeth's participation in these spiritual practices proved particularly meaningful, as her leadership role within the Women's Council required her to help conduct ceremonies that addressed everything from naming newborn children to deciding when and where the community should relocate. Her natural empathy and intelligence made her effective at reading the emotional undercurrents that influenced group dynamics, while her outsider's perspective often revealed solutions that traditional approaches couldn't achieve. The question of identity became increasingly complex as months turned into years, and the children's Comanche lives began to feel more natural than their fading memories of white society. Martha watched them gradually stop translating their thoughts from English into Comanche and begin thinking directly in their adopted language. She observed them developing friendships, romantic interests, and professional aspirations that were entirely indigenous in character. Most powerfully, she saw them beginning to dream in Comanche, the most reliable indicator that their psychological transformation was becoming permanent. But this cultural metamorphosis also created unexpected emotional challenges. The children sometimes struggled with what psychologists would later term survivor's guilt, wondering whether their adaptation to new lives represented a betrayal of their murdered parents' memory. Martha found herself serving as both counselor and advocate, helping them understand that survival required change, that honoring their original families meant preserving the values those families had instilled rather than maintaining specific cultural practices. The broader political situation continued to deteriorate throughout their time with Stone Bear's band, with increasing pressure from military forces seeking to confine all Comanche tribes to designated reservations. Martha witnessed the agonizing debates within tribal councils as leaders struggled to balance their people's traditional freedoms against the growing reality that resistance might lead to complete annihilation. Some warriors advocated for fighting to the death rather than accepting reservation life, while others argued that temporary submission might preserve opportunities for future independence. Running Wolf's intelligence networks provided disturbing information about government policies that were being developed in distant Washington offices by officials who had never seen the plains or met the people whose lives they were determined to control. The federal approach seemed designed to force rapid cultural transformation through the deliberate destruction of traditional economic systems, the separation of children from their families for education in distant boarding schools, and the suppression of religious practices that government agents considered primitive or dangerous. They want to save our souls by destroying everything that makes us who we are. Running Wolf explained bitterly after returning from a trading expedition that had brought news of the latest federal initiatives. They think they're being merciful by offering us the chance to become white people instead of simply killing us all. Martha's journal entries from this period reveal her growing understanding that the frontier conflicts weren't simply about land or resources, but about fundamentally incompatible worldviews regarding humanity's relationship with the natural environment. White settlement patterns assumed that wilderness needed to be conquered and transformed into agricultural or urban landscapes that served human purposes. Comanche culture was based on sustainable adaptation to natural systems that had evolved over millennia to support diverse communities of plants, animals, and people. The two approaches couldn't coexist indefinitely on the same territory. One would ultimately dominate, and the superior military technology of white society made the outcome increasingly predictable. But Martha also recognized that the victory would come at enormous cost to both cultures. Whites would lose the accumulated wisdom of indigenous environmental management, while Comanche people would lose everything that defined their identity and purpose. As the second winter of their captivity approached, Martha realized that her own transformation had progressed beyond simple adaptation to something approaching genuine dual citizenship. She could think like a Comanche when the situation required it, understanding the spiritual and practical considerations that govern tribal decision-making. But she could also maintain her white perspectives when those proved more appropriate, drawing on frontier pragmatism and Christian morality when they offered better solutions to specific problems. This bicultural competence made her increasingly valuable as a mediator during the periodic contacts between Stone Bear's band and white authorities. Her ability to translate not just languages but entire conceptual frameworks enabled communication that might otherwise have been impossible. Government agents who viewed all Indians as savage enemies could sometimes be persuaded to see Comanche people as fellow human beings when Martha explained their motivations and concerns in terms that white listeners could understand. But these mediation efforts also placed her in an increasingly precarious position, as both sides sometimes questioned her loyalties and motivations. Some tribal members worried that her interventions might compromise Comanche negotiating positions, while white officials suspected that her sympathies for indigenous concerns made her an unreliable advocate for settlement interests. Martha found herself walking a narrow path between two worlds that seemed determined to destroy each other. The children's development during this second year revealed the profound plasticity of human identity when circumstances require radical adaptation. Samuel had become genuinely proud of his warrior skills and eagerly anticipated the ceremonies that would mark his transition to full adult status within the tribe. Daniel's mastery of horse management had earned him recognition as one of the most gifted young horsemen in tribal memory. Anne and Robert had integrated so completely into Comanche childhood culture that they rarely spoke English even when alone with Martha. But Elizabeth's evolution proved most remarkable of all. Her natural leadership abilities had flourished within a cultural context that valued female wisdom and authority in ways that white society never permitted. She had become a trusted advisor to tribal leaders, a skilled diplomat who could navigate complex political situations, and a bridge builder who helped maintain harmony between different factions within the community. Her transformation from traumatized refugee to respected tribal member represented the kind of personal growth that was possible when circumstances forced individuals to discover capabilities they never knew they possessed. The arrival of spring brought both hope and anxiety, as the warmer weather enabled renewed military activities that would test everyone's loyalties and survival skills. Government forces were reportedly planning a major campaign designed to force all remaining free Comanche bands onto designated reservations, while some tribal leaders were organizing desperate resistance efforts that might represent their people's last stand for independence. Martha realized that the relatively peaceful interlude of their integration period was ending, and that the choices made during the coming months would determine not just their personal fates, but the future of an entire culture. The morning that would change everything began with an eagle circling overhead, its cry echoing across the awakening camp in what the tribal elders interpreted as a warning of approaching transformation. Martha had learned to read such omens not as supernatural predictions, but as sophisticated observations of natural patterns that often preceded human events. Eagles appeared when large groups were moving across the territory, their keen eyes detecting disturbances that ground-based observers might miss for days. Stone Bear called an emergency council before the sun reached its zenith, gathering not just the traditional leadership, but also the adopted members who had proven their loyalty. Through seasons of shared hardship, Martha found herself seated among advisors whose counsel would determine whether the band would attempt to flee deeper into unconquered territory, seek accommodation with advancing government forces, or make their final stand in defense of the only life they had ever known. The intelligence that prompted this gathering came from Running Wolf's network of contacts across multiple tribes and trading posts. Federal troops were converging on their region from 3 directions, supported by artillery, supply wagons, and Indian scouts from tribes that had already accepted reservation life. This wasn't another routine patrol or limited punitive expedition, but a coordinated campaign designed to eliminate the last pockets of independent Comanche resistance. More disturbing was news that the military forces included specialized units trained in tracking and capturing individuals who had gone native white captives who might be recovered and returned to civilization. Government officials had developed theories about the psychological damage inflicted by prolonged exposure to savage influences, and they were determined to rescue such victims even against their own apparent wishes. They're specifically looking for people like us, Running Wolf explained grimly to Martha and the children during a private meeting after the main council session. They have descriptions, probably from survivors of other raids who reported seeing white faces among Comanche bands. Our presence here isn't secret anymore. Elizabeth's response revealed how completely her perspective had shifted during their time with the tribe. But we're not captives anymore. We're family. How can they rescue us from people who saved our lives? The question highlighted the fundamental disconnect between official government understanding and the lived reality of cross-cultural adoption. Federal policies assumed that white people among Indian tribes were either prisoners awaiting liberation or traitors requiring punishment. The possibility that they might have chosen their circumstances, found genuine belonging, or developed loyalties that transcended racial boundaries was literally inconceivable to authorities, whose worldview couldn't accommodate such complexity. Samuel's warrior training had progressed to the point where he was expected to participate in any military actions the band might undertake. His skills with bow, rifle, and horse were now equal to those of tribal members twice his age, and his tactical understanding of plains warfare had been shaped by masters who had perfected these arts over generations. But the approaching conflict would force him to choose between two different definitions of courage: Comanche concepts that emphasized loyalty to adopted family, or white expectations that demanded allegiance to racial identity. The debate within the tribal council raged for 2 days, with passionate arguments on multiple sides of an issue that offered no satisfactory solutions. The faction favoring immediate flight pointed to successful escapes by other bands who had managed to reach sanctuary in Mexico, or remote mountain territories where pursuit would be difficult. But such journeys required abandoning the sick, elderly, and very young who couldn't endure the hardships of forced migration across hostile terrain. Those advocating resistance emphasized that their current territory offered excellent defensive positions, adequate water supplies, and sufficient game to sustain a siege. They argued that a determined stand might inflict enough casualties to discourage future military campaigns, or at least demonstrate that Comanche independence wouldn't be surrendered without costs that white society might find unacceptable. But everyone understood that successful resistance would require sacrifices that could destroy the band as effectively as any military defeat. The accommodation faction, led by some of the older women who had witnessed previous conflicts, proposed seeking terms that might preserve some degree of cultural autonomy within the reservation system. They pointed to examples of other tribes that had managed to maintain essential traditions while adapting to imposed limitations. But recent reports from established reservations suggested that government policies were specifically designed to eliminate tribal identity through forced assimilation programs that separated families and suppressed indigenous practices. Martha's unique position gave her perspectives that pure tribal members couldn't achieve, but also created terrible dilemmas about where ultimate loyalties should lie. She had genuinely come to love the people who had saved her life and welcomed her into their community. But she also understood better than anyone the technological and numerical advantages that made Comanche resistance ultimately futile. Her silence during the council debates reflected not indecision but the painful recognition that honest advice might doom people she cared about regardless of what she recommended. Baby Lucy's situation encapsulated the moral complexity facing everyone involved in these decisions. Now almost 3 years old, she spoke only Comanche and related to the world entirely through indigenous cultural frameworks. Her adoptive parents, Soaring Eagle and Gentle Rain, loved her exactly as they would their own biological child and would fight to the death to protect her. But government forces would certainly attempt to rescue her from what they perceived as savage captivity, potentially traumatizing a child who knew no other family and subjecting her to cultural shock that could prove psychologically devastating. Daniel's extraordinary bond with the tribal horse herds created additional complications for any decision the band might make. His expertise had become essential to their survival strategies, as his ability to manage hundreds of animals across challenging terrain provided mobility advantages that could prove decisive in either flight or resistance scenarios. But his obvious European features made him a primary target for military units seeking to recover white captives, regardless of his own preferences or the tribal claims on his loyalty. Anne and Robert represented perhaps the most heartbreaking aspect of the approaching crisis. Their complete integration into Comanche childhood culture had given them security, identity, and belonging that replaced the trauma of their original losses. Their adoptive families had invested years of love and care in raising them as true tribal members. But their youth made them particularly vulnerable to government rescue efforts that would tear them from everything they had learned to call home. The council's final decision reflected the wisdom of people who had survived countless previous crises through adaptive flexibility rather than rigid adherence to abstract principles. Instead of choosing a single strategy, Stone Bear announced that the band would split into multiple groups, each pursuing different approaches based on their specific circumstances and capabilities. Families with young children would attempt to reach Mexican territory where government authority was limited. Warriors without dependents would remain to conduct guerrilla resistance that might delay pursuing forces. And those willing to risk accommodation would seek terms with military commanders, but the most difficult decision involved Martha and the adopted white children. Their presence endangered everyone around them while advancing military forces specifically searched for white captives to recover. Yet abandoning them would violate every principle of loyalty and mutual protection that defined Comanche social relationships. The solution that emerged from hours of agonized debate was both elegant and heartbreaking. Running Wolf would escort Martha and those children who chose to leave through secret routes to a location where they could make contact with government forces under circumstances that protected the tribal members who had sheltered them. The children who preferred to remain would be given new identities and integrated into families attempting to reach Mexico, where their European features might actually provide advantages in a society more tolerant of racial mixing. Elizabeth's announcement that she intended to stay with the tribe surprised no one who had witnessed her transformation over the previous months. Her leadership role within the Women's Council, her romantic attachment to a young warrior named Swift Arrow, and her deep spiritual connection to Comanche worldviews had made her more indigenous than white in every way that mattered. Her decision to remain represented not just personal choice, but a form of cultural survival that transcended individual identity. Samuel chose differently, recognizing that his warrior training made him a particular target for military forces that would view him as either a traitor requiring punishment or a victim needing rescue. His skills and knowledge could prove valuable to other Comanche bands if he survived the approaching conflict, but his continued presence with Stone Bear's group would endanger everyone around him. His farewell to the warriors who had trained him carried the gravity of ancient rituals acknowledging bonds that death might interrupt but could never break. Daniel's choice proved the most agonizing of all. His expertise with horses was desperately needed by any group attempting to escape through hostile territory, but his obvious European ancestry made him a liability that could doom the families depending on his skills. His final decision to accompany Martha reflected not preference for white society, but recognition that his survival might be essential for future efforts to preserve Comanche culture through individuals who understood both worlds. Anne and Robert were not given choices that their ages couldn't handle responsibly. Instead, their adoptive families made decisions based on careful evaluation of which options offered the best chances for the children's long-term survival and happiness. Anne would remain with her Comanche mother and attempt the journey to Mexico, while Robert would accompany Martha to whatever future awaited those willing to risk return to white society. The night before their separation was marked by ceremonies that acknowledged the spiritual bonds created through shared suffering and mutual sacrifice. Martha participated in rituals that formally adopted her as a permanent tribal member, regardless of her physical location, while the children received names and symbols that would identify them to any Comanche people they might encounter in future years. These weren't simply sentimental gestures, but practical provisions for maintaining connections across vast distances and uncertain circumstances. Running Wolf's preparation for their dangerous journey revealed the sophisticated intelligence networks that had enabled Comanche survival for generations despite overwhelming odds. Hidden supply caches marked routes that avoided military patrols, while coded signals identified friendly contacts who could provide assistance without compromising their own safety. The escape plan required traveling through territory controlled by hostile forces, but Running Wolf's knowledge of terrain and timing offered reasonable hopes of success. As dawn approached and final preparations concluded, Martha realized that her original identity as Thomas Caldwell's widow had been completely replaced by something more complex and valuable. She was now a bridge between worlds, carrying knowledge and relationships that might prove essential for future peace negotiations. Her survival was no longer just personal, but represented possibilities for understanding that could benefit both cultures if wisdom eventually prevailed over warfare. The farewell between family members, who might never meet again, was conducted with Comanche stoicism that honored deep emotions through controlled expression rather than dramatic display. But Martha could see the profound love and loss in every gesture, every glance, every word of blessing exchanged between people whose bonds had been forged in circumstances that tested everything they believed about loyalty, sacrifice, and the meaning of family itself. Their journey toward an uncertain future began in the gray light before sunrise, with Running Wolf leading Martha and 3 children away from the only security they had known since the massacre that destroyed their original lives. Behind them, the Comanche band prepared for its own desperate gamble with survival, knowing that the choices made during the next few days would determine whether their culture continued to exist or became merely another tragedy commemorated in the oral histories of vanished peoples. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.